Rewind, your week in review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.
I believe united we stand, and we have common ground to find, and we're going to find it. We're not even
I'm Steve Walters.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
This is Rewind, another look at this week in the Capitol, but first, WisconsinEye was there. Democratic Assembly Leader Hintz and Republican Speaker Voss disagree on bipartisanship. What a surprise. The Wisconsin Realtors have issued a new study. There's a housing shortage that most threatens middle and low-income workers. I asked the author of that study what happens in our next recession, Attorney General Josh Kaul, on why we need a red flag law. And UW-Madison Athletic Director Barry Alvarez says if California pays its college athletes and lets them hire agents, he won't schedule them against UW-Madison teams. WisconsinEye was there.
We had the most anti-democratic measure in our state's history. We got international headlines for, "Is democracy dead?" We've never seen anything like this in Wisconsin's history. It's completely made a toxic atmosphere, and I don't think there's any trust or respect for sure.
Now, what we're seeing in Washington, and I hope it doesn't stick in Wisconsin, is kind of this idea that it is a constant 24 bash the other side. We can never find a way to work together. You asked a very simple question of where can we work together, and it turned into how we can be hyper-partisan on the left. And
well,
I think
that's
part of the problem.
A lot of folks will come in and they'll say, trembling, almost like they have to whisper it, like, hey, do you have that marijuana oil? I grew up in, Wisconsin, so it's like marijuana is bad. It's the drug cartel, it's the drug dealers, all the dudes in prison doing cocaine and heroin, and that all got tied together in my mind growing up. So that's, I think, the perception out there and what's been demonized, where we need to pull those apart for people. I found it really helpful to explain this is hemp. This is not marijuana. There's two different crops.
You would never, ever make a farmer, a corn farmer, open up his fields for pheasant hunting to every Tom, Dick, and Harry because he got a tax break. And yet that is exactly what you want to do to people that raise the crop of fiber and that raise trees.
What happens to this squeeze on the housing shortage in a potential recession? Professor?
That's the kind of thing that should keep us up at night, because construction costs are unlikely to go down significantly in a recession, but people's incomes are going to go down. Regardless of your income level, everybody needs a place to live. So you can either lower the cost of housing, which is hard to do other than through building more supply, or you can raise people's income, which is also hard to do.
I think a red flag law makes a lot more sense. I think these decisions about whether or not somebody presents a danger shouldn't be made by somebody who's selling firearms, but rather should be made by a judge based on testimony in a formal proceeding.
Back in year 2000, diagnosed with bone and lung cancer. It was a terminal diagnosis, and he had to make the tough decision to go outside the law and go get marijuana because it was the only thing that gave him his appetite back and kept food down. So I am thoroughly convinced that it gave him time that he otherwise wouldn't have had.
We need more money going towards restorative justice. Let's keep our young people out of jail in the first place, because some of them don't belong there.
We also need mental health treatments for all of this trauma that immigration is causing us. It's not just about getting licensed, it's about getting better and coming through together.
California student athletes can have have an agent and collect on name, image, and likeness. If that passes in those states, my opinion, they probably wouldn't be permitted to play for a national championship. I wouldn't schedule anyone from California right now if they have different rules than we do. This is amateur athletics, and so I'm very concerned with it.
Last week we said there's a special election date in the 7th Congressional District, Northwest Wisconsin. Now we say never mind, because why?
Well, there's a conflict between state law and federal law, and the governor apparently decided to ignore the federal law and issue the initial call to follow state law. Though it sounds convoluted, and it kind of is, but here's the deal. State law in Wisconsin says a special election, when you call the date for that special, the primary must be 28 days before the general election. Yeah. Federal law, however, says with a federal election, ballots must be sent to overseas military voters at least 45 days prior to the election. Now, you have a conflict there. Much larger winner for the federal law, or federal rules than the state rules. Apparently, Evers knew about this because the Elections Commission says, we told them.
Mm-hmm.
Governor's office says, yeah, we were aware of it, but we followed their advice to follow state law, which puzzles people I talk to because there's a thing called the Supremacy Clause, which says basically that federal law trumps everything else. So I'm not quite clear why they decided to follow the state law but not the federal law.
Okay, so now let's talk about the potential dates. We're looking at one option, the primary February 4 and the special election April 7th, or the second option that you guys floated this week, primary February 18th and special election May 5th. Which one do you think is more likely?
People I talked to this week think that the original reason the governor tried to have this special election in January and December
20,
was to avoid having it impact the state Supreme Court race. Okay, now that's a lot of dates I'm going to throw out, but the state Supreme Court race is going to be on the ballot April 7th.
April 7th.
That day we're going to have a presidential primary as well, both of them actually. We don't think right now there's going to be much of a race for the Republican nomination because Donald Trump is pretty solid with Republicans and the challengers aren't really taking off. In fact, some states are canceling their primaries, Republican side, right? However, we think, and I say think, the Democratic primary will be still going on come April 7th. If that happens, you're talking about a big surge in Democratic turnout.
Yeah.
Go back to 2016, same thing happened. We had 1 million voters in the Democratic primary for president, 1.1 million in the GOP primary. Look at this past spring when Brian Hagedorn won that state Supreme Court race with a surge of conservative enthusiasm, got about 600,000 votes. So Democrats feel like if they have that primary on the ballot April 7th, it improves their chances of beating conservative Justice Daniel Kelly. So why do you avoid that special election that date? Because if you have the 7th on April 7th, the general election, you have a heavily Republican seat and you're maybe bringing out more Republicans you would otherwise. So Evers tried, people I talked to, avoid that. All right, so now the option for him are to line up one of these special elections with one piece of the spring election. So the kind of the betting money right now is he avoids the April 7th date altogether. There's a primary February 18th, which means the general will be May 5th. The problem with that is that Evers said he scheduled the January and December election to start with to fill that seat as soon as possible because of impeachment, the trade war, and everything going on. How do you then justify pushing back the general until May if that was your goal to start with?
Okay, but it seems to me every week, JR, we talk about Democrats who saying they aren't going to run in the 7th District, and the Democrat of the week who's saying, I'm not going to run, was State Representative Nick Milroy. So, again, I'm going to ask you, who's still considering it on the Dem side? Because you got Jason Church and Senator Tiffany.
There's also a businessman from up there who announced that he's going to run. So we have 3 candidates who've announced. On the Democratic side, we have Janet Bewley has not said one way or another what she's going to do just yet. Margaret Engebretson, who ran against Duffy last time. There's a Wausau School Board president, I think, Tricia Zunker, who's thinking about it. So my impression has been that there are several Dems kicking the tires, thinking about, okay, do I want to run? And some Dems have told me the best bet is to have a discussion of, okay, who is the strongest among us to take on this race? Because if you can get everybody behind one person in one shot, that person can have the free rein to raise the money, build the infrastructure, and get ready for the election.
Okay, but if I'm a Democrat considering running in the 7th District, am I more interested in that April 7th date with a larger turnout, aren't I?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if this seat acts like it normally does in November of 2020, a Republican will win it. So yeah, if Democrats were to win the 7th Congressional District in the special election, it would send shockwaves nationally.
Didn't you tell me that the 7th District went for Trump by 16 points?
21 points.
21 points, thanks, I had it wrong.
So if you have the best Democratic turnout, which would be during the primary, that might be your best chance to win. Okay. But that wouldn't be temporary. You'd have that seat until November election and likely, barring something crazy happening, lose it. If you're a Democrat looking at Wisconsin, you're saying, I'd rather have a better shot at winning a Supreme Court seat for 10 years than having a congressional seat for 6 to 8 months. Now, again, the message, however, would resonate across the country of if Democrats do well in that seat, or even if they don't win it, if they do really, really well, that Donald Trump has a problem with his base because the 7th is blue-collar, white, rural, these are the things that the voters that Donald Trump needs in 2021.
So the takeaway here is there will be a spring elections in the 7th Congressional District, but we can't yet tell you when. And just this note, this week, Rachel Campos Duffy, the wife of former Representative Sean Duffy, they had a baby girl, and Sean said on social media that she'll be having to undergo heart surgery, so we wish them the best. Okay, new subject. Joint Finance met this week. Let's talk about 3 things they did. First thing they did, $45 million more for the UW system. Now this is in addition to the about $1.1 billion per year in GPR money that the UW system gets. So what was the hang up on the $45 million?
So Republicans in the Joint Finance Committee took a number of steps during this budget process to say, okay, we're going to appropriate this money, but we're going to keep it in our committee for a while and make you come back and ask for it. Basically what they want to see is how would UW spend the money. So the regents in August basically approved an outline of how they would do it through performance-based funding. That kind of exercise, and it was like an example of what might happen. It's not a done deal, but under that exercise, I think UW gets like 40% of the new money. So this is like the boost in funding for operations, right, for UW. They had to come back and say, here's our plan. UW said, okay, now you're good, here's your money.
Okay, but the point here is they had to come back with a spending plan for an additional $45 million.
One of many agencies required to do that on various things.
That's true. Okay, they also approved $220,000 for a suicide hotline. Let's listen to some of the back and forth between Senator Erpenbach and Representative John Nygren on that.
We all agree. Okay, give them the money. Let them gather the information. Let them get the software, but don't make them wait 3 months like we're essentially making them do right now. We said yes in July, and now we're saying yes again in October. And I'm not certain we have any more information now. We might have a little more information now based on what they want to do with $110,000 than we did back in July. I get the due diligence, but this, in my eyes, is not due diligence. This is just holding things up for a couple of months.
The motion that we will be adopting is actually based on the reporting of the task force, which is co-chaired by both a Republican and a Democrat. And that the reporting items that we'll be placing into our motion are consistent with what they recommended. I would also even suggest that perhaps we might have even been doing some other changes here today if 4 members, minority members of that task force hadn't decided to leak their initial report to the media because it wasn't going the way they wanted it to. So due diligence, proper process is all part of our responsibilities, whether you want to admit it or not.
Why this bitter debate over $220,000 to fund a suicide hotline in a budget off funds of $75 billion?
It's been a recurring theme with this committee of Democrats complaining, you kept this money to burden the administration, to put them through hoops to get it. Why are you delaying the funding, which should have been released, in their words, months ago? Republicans continue to counter, look, we've done this before. This is called your job, your duty as a member of finance to do your due diligence, to have oversight of how money is spent. We're just keeping an eye on things. This money also was at the heart of this kind of flare-up last week about the Speaker's Task Force Suicide Prevention, because the original draft that we saw,
as Nygren said, was leaked by the by Democrats on the Suicide Prevention Task Force.
That's their suspicion. I can't confirm that or deny that. But the original idea was to create a new bill to appropriate the money with new strings attached, reporting requirements, going through a different agency. If they had done the bill, it would have delayed the process more versus asking Joint Finance, release the money and add these requirements to it.
Right, right.
And one of the requirements is they want to go through Department of Health Services, not through Department of Public Construction, because they want DHS, this task force, to be the central point for suicide prevention efforts in Wisconsin going forward.
And a programming note, next Wednesday I'll be interviewing the co-chairs of that suicide prevention. Okay, let's talk about one more thing that Joint Finance approved. $8.8 million for a dairy hub. This will coordinate new research between the UW's Madison, Platteville, and River Falls campus on animal health, welfare, human health and nutrition, land and water. I'll be doing the newsmakers at some point with the leaders of this group. Any PSs on the dairy hub?
Interesting debate was coming as Sonny Perdue was in town, making some interesting comments.
That's where we're going next. Okay, thank you for the segue. Wisconsin is incredibly important to the Trump re-election.
Yes.
So how helpful is it when your U.S. Ag Secretary, Sonny Perdue, comes to World Dairy Expo, which is still going on, and says, it's very difficult on an economy of scale with the capital needs and all the environmental regulations and everything else today to survive milking 40, 50, or 60, or even 100 cows. Dairy cows haven't gone to slaughter. They've gone to someone else's herd. And before I give you a chance to answer, I want to quote Darren Rudin, who milks 50 cows, who says, the trend of dairy farm consolidations is not a good way to go. Do we want one company owning all our food in this country? Mr. Van Ruden is president of the Wisconsin Farmers Union. Big gaffe here by by the federal ag secretary?
Especially because he was in Minnesota about 2 months ago and told a very ill-timed joke that he said he heard from a Pennsylvania farmer of what do you call two farmers in a basement? A wine cellar.
What?
Yeah. So you think he would have learned from the fallout of that from August that maybe you should watch what you're saying, especially when you're visiting a state where we have had a record number of dairy farms going under. Now, when I've talked to people about this, there's people who tell you, look, he may have a point. We may be at a point that we need to look at consolidation, that's the only way forward for dairy farms. But we have a tradition in Wisconsin of seeing those smaller. My grandfather farmed, his father before him farmed a dairy farm in southeastern Wisconsin. They did not have 500 cows, but that was 50 years ago. It's a different industry now. So Purdue may have a point, but it's so tone deaf to come into a state where they're struggling with that change about where to go to say something like this. And now somebody told me that this week. Trump needs the dairy industry, the farming industry to be behind him because he won them in 2016. Mm-hmm. This is an easy ad to run in Wisconsin and rural area state about he doesn't think you can survive and doesn't.
And you saw the immediate piling on by the Democratic Party officials. They lined up a press conference, and the governor was critical of it.
Travis Tranel, a Republican from southwestern Wisconsin, dairy farmer, his shared family farm, him and his cousins, they milk about 500 cows or so. But that's kind of everybody putting the herd together. He said, look, when you lose a family farm, you lose a farm family. So you lose a family in church, you lose a family paying taxes, a family in school. And his line from his letter was, I would expect him to explain this with a member of the Secretary of Defense, not the Secretary of Agriculture. This is not good. Work with us on a way forward, not say things like this.
And tragically, as you alluded to, we're losing about 2 dairy farms a day in the state of Wisconsin. So far, 561, 2018, 638, 2017, 561. So,
and let's be honest, that trend's not new. I remember covering the U.S. Senate race in 2000 with Herb Kohl, and him being challenged on that very thing by the Republican opponent, saying there's a dairy problem in Wisconsin. It's been going on for a long, long time. It's just accelerating.
Right. Okay, now let's talk about a ruling by a federal judge, James Peterson, with a number of challenges to the lame duck laws. And the Democratic Party filed one of them in federal court. It said that it's illegal, but Judge Peterson basically said this week, Democratic Party of Wisconsin, you were not harmed. Okay, I'm going to toss your lawsuit, and we still have 2 lawsuits pending in the state Supreme Court. One, thank you. And that one will be heard at 1:30 p.m., oral arguments on October 21st.
Yep. So basically Peterson said, look, there are things to complain about with this law, but that dispute belongs in state court, not federal court. By the way, if you guys had standing, there would be other problems with your arguments. They basically made a First Amendment argument that this was retaliation against Democrats because they won the governor's race, and that there are all these kind of like First Amendment issues. It just didn't seem to fly with Peterson, who was an Obama appointee, by the way. This is not a conservative judge. Really, the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, already ruled that it's not going to dictate to the legislature when it can meet, because one of the challenges to these laws was they met in extraordinary session. That was improper. Therefore, the actions were null and void. A Dane County judge agreed with that lawsuit. State Supreme Court said, no, we are not going to meddle with when the legislature meets. This next suit that's going before the state Supreme Court October 21st, it's a separation of powers issue. But when I've talked to people about this, their bet is that the Supreme Court, with a 5-2 conservative majority, will side with Republicans. Now, to Republicans, because it's the law, their job as justices is to not to change, be activists, but to make sure the law is good. They're going to side with the law. To liberals, it's because they think the court is bought and paid for by the very groups that want these laws changed.
Okay, but let's talk about precedent here. We've been having laws passed by extraordinary and special sessions going back to the 1970s.
Yep.
Okay, but thanks for the correction. There's only one pending lawsuit in the state Supreme Court?
And that is it is the separation of powers issue. There was one other legal action, and that was over the vote restrictions on early voting.
Yes.
That's already been taken care of.
Yeah.
Got knocked out last January. By the way, being the geek that I am, I tracked the legal bills that we've seen from these lawsuits. There's about $200,000 in the federal suit that was tossed out. We're north of, I think, $1.2 million in the lame duck suits altogether to date. More is going to come. Now, lawmakers have been charging taxpayers, Republican lawmakers charge taxpayers for lawsuits over Planned Parenthood, challenging state statutes, environmental lawsuits, redistricting. Mm-hmm. In this case, they kind of didn't really have a choice because AG Josh Call said, look, I can't defend anybody else because it's about my powers.
The lame duck
There's
laws
a conflict of
affected
interest.
his authority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Okay. I want to point out that there have been, let me get the numbers right, 1,000 cases of what's called vaping-associated pulmonary illness and 18 deaths, and thank goodness none of them in Wisconsin. And we started taxing, the state of Wisconsin, our state revenue department, started taxing vaping liquids this week on October 1. We're going to tax vaping liquids shipped to retailers and consumers in Wisconsin, vaping liquids produced in Wisconsin for sale in Wisconsin, and where it could bring in on a 12-month basis, according to the Fiscal Bureau, $3.2 million. But I want to point out in February, Governor Evers proposed taxing a much broader on vaping products, taxing them similar to tobacco, and the governor's proposal would have brought in $19.8 million per year. Do you see any link between the vaping illnesses and the taxes? Anything on the fall agenda?
I'm still waiting to see if they're going to do anything about tobacco this fall. Remember, the governor last week said he is open to the idea of raising the age to buy tobacco to 21, but he fears it gives vaping a pass. Vaping advocates say they're getting a kind of a bad deal here because a lot of the illnesses we're seeing are from people vaping THC, which is different thing. So they're feeling like they're under attack. I just don't know if there's a consensus among Republicans to get something done. Like we said before, to pass a bill right now, you have to have majority support from Republicans. So the Assembly, that's 50 members of the Assembly, Republican caucus, and 17 Republican senators in the Senate.
Okay, but after we taped the show last week, I did a Newsmakers with Health Services Secretary Andrea Palm, and I said, should the governor, like other governors, perhaps in New Jersey and New York, issue executive orders that limit the accessibility of some of these vaping products, especially to youth? And she said, we're studying that. Mm-hmm. So we don't know yet what authority he may or may not have. Interesting. Okay, your stock reports. Rising.
So Scott Fitzgerald, this week Matt Walker said he's not going to run for the 5th Congressional District.
You surprised by that?
No. In talking to people, there's a feeling that Scott Walker, his father, maybe wanted this more than Matt Walker did. Remember, Scott Walker served as governor for 8 years, got executive in Milwaukee, ran for president, smart state lawmaker. Matt Walker said basically he can do stuff out in the world beyond government to kind of improve life in southeastern Wisconsin. Well, what's happening is the field is shrinking. We talked a month ago about this really wide open field of like all kinds of Republicans. So far, Fitzgerald is in. I'm waiting to hear from Matt Newman, who's son of Mark Newman, former congressman. Kevin Nicholson, running for U.S. Senate, last year's Republican. Adam Nalen, state lawmaker from Waukesha.
Senator Cappinga.
Cappinga.
Where's he?
He is in, basically.
Is he?
And Ben Vogel, who is a aide to Ron Johnson. The smaller the field gets, the better it is for Fitzgerald, people tell me. In part because he is out there, the only one right now who is able to raise money, who is locking up endorsements, who is laying a foundation for a run. Now with Nalen and Vogel, the challenge is going to be how do you create a fundraising network that can rival what Fitzgerald has after 2 decades plus in the legislature, being the Senate Majority Leader, running the Senate GOP's campaign arm all these years. Yeah. That's a tough task.
Yeah.
With the others, though, Matt Newman has probably until the end of the year to make a decision because he has personal money. So it affords him time to figure out what he wants to do. Nicholson, when I talk to people, they think he wants to run for U.S. Senate in 2022 or governor, that his eye is more on a statewide race, but he's taken his time to figure out what this is going to look like for him. He also, by the way, has a group called No Better Friend, which is to advance a conservative cause. It, however, also employs a great deal of people who used to work for his campaign.
Oh, okay.
So he could flip the switch if he wanted to. Capping is interesting because he's a successful businessman. He has some personal money to put in. The question would be, how do you differentiate himself from Fitzgerald? Would he say, look, I've done the same things that Fitzgerald has, or would he try and run from farther from the right and like try and be more conservative on like, well, I don't like this budget, or I don't like this bill. We're watching to see what Cap does in that regard. See what he's going to do.
But one takeaway from this discussion to me is that Matt Walker is going to run for something someday.
Possibly. Oh, and Cap's other advantage, like Matt Newman, is that he's from the voter-rich part of that district in Waukesha County. Fitzgerald's from the northwestern part. Fitz's challenge is to get better known in that kind of heart of it, but talk radio can play a big deal in how that plays out for him.
Okay, mixed.
So this is total geekdom, but lobbyist contributions. So if you're a state lawmaker, Scott, or Steve, you know this for a long time, right? You can't get a personal contribution from a lobbyist until the session is done.
Right, from a lobbyist,
right? Personal check. For Scott Fitzgerald and Tom Tiffany, that also applies when you're running for Congress. Now, for Fitz, it shouldn't be a problem because the session ends May 13th. The election is normally in November, so he's got a window to raise from lobbyists, no problem. For Tiffany, however, in the 7th District, we don't have a date yet, but even if he goes to May 5th, that special, he's not giving that window where you can accept a lobbyist contribution, a personal one. Other caveat, lobbying groups who register with who co-sponsor a federal PAC, they can still give to state lawmakers. So just something to watch, the dynamic of raising money in these races, that Tiffany has a little bit different situation than Fitzgerald does.
Okay, but I give that the Geek Award of the Week.
Thank you.
Okay, falling.
So Don Krim, after this week,
Secretary of the Department of
Safety and Professional Services.
Thank you.
After this week, every member of the Tony Evers cabinet has had a committee vote except for one, Don Krim.
Yes.
Chris Capigna is the chair of the Senate committee that has her nomination. His office told me this week it does not plan to have an executive session anytime soon because of concerns raised about her nomination. Now, part of this is, not the only reason, but part is a 2005 charge because she stabbed her son's hand with a pen repeatedly as punishment. She talked about it during the confirmation hearing back in March.
Said it was the worst decision. Yep, worst decision she ever made. She was not convicted of anything. Let's be clear about that.
Yep. So that's all back there from then. But if you can't get a committee vote, you can't get to the floor.
Yeah.
Here's the dynamic. And we talked about this before. Republicans in the Senate now are figuring out who they want to take to the floor this fall and knock out.
As early as next week, right?
My guess is, and we're sitting here Friday morning, I don't have the list yet, but before too long, we'll have a list of who they're going to take up next week.
Next week, and it's probably going to be Tuesday, a Senate
Yes,
session?
on the floor Tuesday.
Okay.
What I'm hearing is, look, that's also a quick caveat. We're in October. Nobody's been confirmed yet. I don't remember that ever happening to any governor in my time covering the state capitol. But there are a couple things at play here. One, there's a broken relationship between the legislative branch, executive branch of Wisconsin right now. There just is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean Republicans who run the legislative branch and the Democratic governor and his staff.
Yep.
Number two, there is still resentment among Senate Republicans over the way some of Walker's final appointees were treated by Governor Evers. Because remember that lame duck session, there were confirmation votes for people like Ellen Novak at the PSC. Mm-hmm. When there was a Dane County ruling to rescind everything that happened in that December extraordinary session, Evers rescinded those appointments. Republicans weren't very happy about that. Even though Ellen got her job back, she got back pay.
She's on the PSC as we speak.
Didn't help. And oh, by the way, the Senate has not met a whole lot so far this year.
Right.
It's been a pretty light calendar. But what I'm watching for is who gets through.
Yeah.
My guess is that there's still going to be some cabinet picks who don't get to the floor anytime soon. Craig Thompson, transportation is one of those I'm talking about. Because if you put any of these cabinet picks on the floor, even Don Krim, I will bet you money they'll get 17 votes. They'll get 14 Democrats and at least 3 Republicans. But I'm not sure a Craig Thompson or an Andrea Palm at DHS would get 17 GOP votes. And Fitzgerald's rule has been he has to have 17 GOP votes for anything to go through that chamber.
I think the Petrowski. I think the Senator Petrowski's backing of Craig Thompson. Mm-hmm. I think he goes through. I think Palm goes through, but we're almost out of time. Go ahead.
With Krim, in her nomination, here's a good example. Devin Lemmy.
That's in deep weeds. I don't disagree there.
Devin Lemmy, who's a Republican on that committee, he told me that he's got concerns because it's taking longer to approve big commercial building projects. but he's okay with her nomination for the most part. Both them support it. That's 3 of the 5 members of that committee. But the chair of the committee does not support her nomination, as far as I can tell. That's what's holding it up. And until she gets a committee vote, she can't get on the floor.
And that's why she's falling. Okay, next week, WisconsinEye, of course, will be covering this. We expect a Senate session, and I'm interviewing, as I said, the co-chairs of the Suicide Prevention Task Force on Wednesday. I'm Steve Walters.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
That's Rewind for October 4.
Rewind, Your Week in Review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.